Welcome to Free the Mind, Free the People, a podcast where we come together to empower each other through knowledge and discuss the issues that shape our everyday lives. All opinions and information shared in this podcast are held by the hosts alone and do not represent the stances of the University of Central Florida and the Department of Sociology. Hi everyone, welcome back to our new episode of Free the Mind, Free the People. I'm Hallie Spencer.
And I'm Marina. And today we're gonna have this is our third official episode, and we're gonna have a new guest, a guest scholar in this episode. So in this episode, we will first introduce the three main theories or perspectives that we learn in sociology to understand the world. And after that brief discussion, we will introduce our guest scholar, which is Dr. Jonathan Cox from the Sociology Department at UCF.
Dr. Jonathan Cox is a race scholar and our professor for our critical race theory class that we're both a part of. Many social theory discusses much of their attention on three main paradigms, which we have found are mostly by white European men. And we are basically here to talk about why we want to change that and how we can. Sociology overall has been dominated by white men. The Chicago School is credited for the creation of sociology as a discipline, despite the work of the Atlanta School led by W.E.B. Du Bois and scholars of color. And their work has been largely removed from the canon and just ignored overall. There are many scholars of color that were largely ignored, and this is the foundation of what we will be discussing today.
Yes, so we also wanted to make sure to continue our conversation from last episode, which was on intellectual activism, and go listen to that if you haven't. So in that episode, we discussed the importance of speaking truth to power and pointing people to systems of oppression which have excluded people of color. And that includes academia, unfortunately. So in this episode, we hope to center the voices of those sociologists who are excluded by white male-dominated sociology. But first, we do want to review the three main sociological theories, which are structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism.
So to start off with structural functionalism, it was created by Durkheim. And the foundation of this theory is that society is made up of many different parts working together. And when functioning properly, they promote solidarity and a prosperous society. An easy way to remember this is structural functionalism is about function and society having a function. Just like a human body, different organs have functions that ultimately work together to create a working body. But the real question is, what happens when one of these organs stop functioning?
Yes, so Durkheim talked about anomie, which is a state of normlessness, which basically means that when solidarity becomes fractured, and there are no controls on human behavior or desires, society sort of loses its structure and its order. So again, this leads to individuals becoming restless or isolated, and Durkheim theorized that suicide can be caused by a state of anomie.
So the next one we're going to be talking about is conflict theory.
Yes, and so this is primarily associated with Karl Marx's work. And so to start off, I'm going to talk about how Marx understood society. For him, society is made up of a constant struggle for resources and power. And this society is divided between the property owners, which are called the bourgeoisie, and the propertyless, which are called the proletariat. And you may have heard the haves or have-nots. And so in this society, the worker is separated from the products that they produce, their human essence, and each other. And this leads to the exploitation of workers by those who own the means of production. And the means of production is basically factories, large businesses, and by extension, the political process.
Yeah, there's a lot of complicated sounding words in this. So we want to make sure we break it down so it makes sense. But Marx argued that the bourgeoisie, don't ask me how to spell that, are their own grave diggers, and eventually the proletariats or the have-nots will gain something called class consciousness. And class consciousness is the recognition that the proletariats are being exploited by the bourgeoisie as a whole unit. And when this happens, the proletariat will seize the means of production and abolish private property. And at the time that Marx wrote this, abolishing private property meant that it was getting rid of anything that generated profit for the bourgeoisie, which could include factories and large businesses. And this would ultimately lead to a classless, stateless society.
So in conclusion, Marx called this a communist revolution. And this revolution would not be a revolution of the mind, but a revolution led by a communist party that was made up of workers who would represent the interests of the proletariat, which are the workers. So the third and last the main sociological theory that we will discuss is symbolic interactionism.
So the foundation of symbolic interactionism was created by sociologist Max Weber. And this theory argues that the world is constructed by meanings that we attach to objects, people, events, and interactions. So these symbols are defined and redefined through repeated social interactions with each other. And in short, we create our meanings through language and symbols.
Yes, so basically symbolic interactionism looks at the middle area between the macro, or like the big social structure, like Marx and Durkheim focused on, and the micro, which are the individual interactions, or like interpersonal interactions. So in this case, Weber and others like George Herbert Mead and Herbert Blumer discuss how created among individuals through social interaction also shape the social structure, rather than looking at the historical events or an established social order. So this middle section of society is basically like organizations, communities, basically wherever social interaction happens.
So if you liked learning about this and you want to learn more, in the description to this episode, we have links to Crash Course Sociology YouTube videos that explain each of these more in depth. And our amazing advisor, Dr. Hinojosa, was a researcher and writer on the series, so go support him in that too.
Absolutely.
So now that we've briefly discussed what is considered to be the main sociological theories, we'd like to now introduce our guest expert for this episode, Dr. Jonathan Cox of UCF's Department of Sociology. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so to start off, tell us a bit about yourself. So what is your educational background? What are your interests in sociology? And what led you to become a race scholar specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And again, thanks for having me. This is a really fantastic thing that you all been doing. I'm really excited to join you for today.
Thank you.
So my background is actually in education. It's not sociology, interestingly enough. I studied at Hampton University for undergrad, which is a historically Black college, historically Black university rather, in Virginia. And my major was health and phys ed, it was kind of a dual degree. So I was actually certified to teach K through 12 health and physical education courses. But kind of quickly decided, you know what, this is not for me. Let's figure out something else. And so after that, I decided to go pursue my master's in college student affairs. So I earned that degree at Penn State University. And then I worked as a college administrator actually for several years in multicultural affairs. And so it was through that experience and all the different things that I was doing working there that I figured out that I actually had a really big love of teaching. So I went back to school to get my PhD so that I could teach at the collegiate level. And so my first social class actually wasn't until I was in my PhD program at the University of Maryland. So I kind of had an interesting background that got me there. Yeah, it was great. It's a great experience. I really loved it being there. So in terms of my research, as you all said, I am a race scholar. So my primary interests lie at the intersections of race and racism with other social phenomena. So I consider myself also to be a critical race theorist. And so that just means that in part, I see racism as a central feature of US society. So currently, most of my research looks at things like racial identities and racial ideology, the racialized experiences of college students. And also, most recently, I've been looking a lot into diversity processes and attitudes as well.
Interesting.
Awesome.
So how was it like making the jump from what you originally studied to sociology, and what made you decide to stick with it?
Yeah, it was a big change. I will say that first year of my PhD program was quite interesting because I had obviously been trained in education. It was a little bit different. And so sociology is very theoretical, which you don't necessarily know that until you kind of start to get into the nitty gritty of learning all these different things. And so that was quite an adjustment, but I came to love certain aspects of that and certain aspects of the theory. And I also just made sure that I've really integrated my work so that it's more ground level, because I'm really big on public sociology and practices that are actually going to do something, right, to change something. Not that scholarship for itself doesn't, right? It's good to learn some of these things, but I do believe that we should be using some of this knowledge that we have to actually impact positive change. And so, yeah, it was a great experience, kind of shifting and changing over. I also think it just really opened up my worldview even further, because with education, obviously you're focusing more specifically on college students and what's going on there. But then sociology gave me the tools to look at things from that more macro levels of society, kind of understanding the sociological and societal processes that are in place that lead to the experiences that people have, how they're different, and then also explaining, inequalities, which is a huge aspect of what I study.
Right.
Perfect.
So, I thought you were going to ask your question. I guess I have one follow-up question to that. So, how would you say that your personal experiences kind of influence your path in both of those fields?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, I study race, and so that for a lot of people that might make sense, given that I identify as a Black man, and so in America for sure, right, that comes with a lot. And so the experiences that I had just throughout school and life really kind of poured into what I ended up doing now. And so in particular, right, the transition from Hampton University, this historically Black and predominantly Black space, to Penn State, which is like in the middle of nowhere. I was at the main campus. So it's literally in the dead center of Pennsylvania in the mountains. I mean, I grew up around mostly Black and white people. My high school was about 50-50. And so, I had all these friends and things of that nature. But when I went to Penn State, I discovered that it was just a much different type of white person. Right there, there were people in my program who had, were in their early 20s who were saying that they literally had never spoken to another Black person before me, at least not in depth, right? And so just that kind of transition was, it was incredible. It really helped to start to really drive my passions towards, understanding the experience of marginalized students and how race really played into that, which is why I went into multicultural affairs specifically. And so, yeah, that's all kind of informed, right? My experiences being a person of color, being racialized in the ways that I am, seeing how things are different, right? And then also, which a big part of my research, I look at the intra-racial differences. A lot of people focus on the differences between different racial groups, but I like to also showcase that there are many differences that exist within each racial group, right? It's not monolithic. And so my own experiences, with friends, kind of seeing the experiences that I had, once I intersected that with my social class background and some of the both of my parents are educators. And so the knowledge and things that I had was just different, even from people that I grew up like right down the street from. And so all those experiences really helped me to got me to this point of understanding things from this perspective, really drove me to really be interested in critical race theory as an ideology, or as a perspective rather, a theoretical perspective. So yes, it's really my experiences that led me to this, and then understanding and seeing the experiences of other people and how just even the smallest of things can completely change people's perspectives and the way they experience the world around them.
Yes, and that's pretty much what we've sort of been discussing throughout this whole series, is just how, at least for us, Hallie as a Jewish woman and me as a Puerto Rican woman, how that has really played into our scholarship and our interest in sociology, and also how our voices are much more, they're very needed. They're very needed in this space, because we come from a totally different perspective. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's why sociology is a really comforting just field to be in, because you feel like your voice, most of the time, hopefully, it does actually matter. Like, we talk about intersectionality a lot and just the need for a lot of different perspectives. And I think in some other fields that doesn't happen very often. So it's a very sometimes depressing kind of field to go into, but it's also a very welcoming field at times too. Despite some of its past, just like dominated by white men, it still feels like it's a welcoming field for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned a little bit of the work that you did, and to take a step backwards to our first discussion where Marina and I talked about like the canon of sociology. in what ways do you utilize the broad theoretical approaches in your work? And what do these theories also lack when you're doing your work?
Sure. So I mean, I definitely use them in ways, and I'll kind of talk through some of the ways I use them, but then at the end, maybe kind of wrap up on maybe some of the ways that can be limiting as well. But if we think about functionalism, I mean, again, a majority of my research focuses on racism and racial ideologies, specifically colorblindness and its corollary, colorblind racism. And so when we think about that, racism serves a very specific function in society, right? It's the maintenance of white supremacy and domination, right? Also the subordination of racially and ethnically minoritized groups, and the exploitation of subordinated racial groups for resources, for labor, other things, right? So that's a very functional thing. A lot of people probably don't generally think of racism as functional, but it totally is. So if we look at colorblindness as an example, right, we know that it works to minimize and mask the impact of racism in the lives of people of color, again, towards that maintenance of white domination. And so as the dominant ideology since the civil rights era, colorblindness really works to just co-opt the language of equality in ways that maintain the racial status quo and explains away racial matters, right? So people can use colorblindness to oppose practical solutions to racial inequalities, right? For instance, by relying on ostensibly non-racialized ideas like meritocracy or equal opportunity, right? So that's a functional way I kind of pull some of that stuff in. Conflict theory, right? Obviously, I'm pulling from conflict theory a lot in many ways, as just much research does that focuses on racial inequalities, right? So in particular, I utilize a lot of like Black feminist approaches, so like Patricia Hill Collins and others work on intersectionality or the matrices of oppression. With interactionism, I really connect my work through that a lot because I'm really interested in meaning-making processes that are involved in social interactions. And so again, I study racial identities, and that's a combination of both self-identified racial identity and externally attributed race, right? So for example, I did a project looking at racial authenticity and boundary drawing around identity for Black students at predominantly white and historically Black institutions, right? So a lot of this work, again, kind of pulls from a lot of these things. But in towards, the question of what might be lacking, right? And so while I was saying that some of this might be limited, I think in general, it can be very limiting to try to fit your work into like one of these perspectives based on their generally more rigid definitions. Because the reality is that social life doesn't fit neatly into one of these perspectives, right? There's overlap across all of them. And so in order to have a more complete, complex understanding of our social world and social processes, right, it really necessitates an understanding of the interplay between these perspectives, right? So for instance, you can't effectively study racism if you narrow your approach to only conflict theory or only functionalism, right? There'll be some things that you miss. So that would be maybe an area where I would say will be a little bit limiting if you just kind of try to put yourself in just the one box.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So I guess I have a question going off of that. So again, in our intellectual activism episode, we talked a little bit about some scholars and some theories or perspectives that were marginalized compared to those three main theories that we talked about. And so we wanted to know some examples of those marginalized theories and those scholars that have been at the forefront of developing these theories.
Sure. So, I mean, if we're thinking about marginalized perspectives, right, they typically come from people who are themselves part of marginalized groups, right? So like racially and ethnically minoritized people or queer scholars. So I think we should also acknowledge that some more marginalized scholarship can appear often to not be marginalized, right? So for instance, through tokenization processes, or if we operate in spaces with higher representation of marginalized groups. But as compared to, right, like quote unquote mainstreamed or normalized perspectives, like those that make up the traditional sociological canon, we can see that they do actually in fact exist at the margins. And so for example, the American Sociological Association can spotlight marginalized work through a conference theme, right? They've done that before. But at the same time, work of marginalized scholars or work that centers on marginalized people, it still continues to be limited in large part to, these more specialized or topical journals. It's not as often seen in journals like ASR, right? Like the big ASA journal. Another thing we think about is, as an example of a marginalized perspective like this would be intersectionality, right, which you all brought up. And so intersectionality grew out of Black feminists and activists' critiques of anti-racist social movements, white feminist movements, and workers' rights movements in the 60s and 70s, that they felt really failed to fully incorporate the experiences of Black women, which sit at the intersection of their multiple identities, right? And so some of the earlier pioneers of intersectionality would include scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw, she's the one who actually coined the term, Patricia Hill Collins, Gloria Anzalua, Bell Hooks, but there are actually even scholars earlier than that, right? Like Anna Julia Cooper, Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, right? They really helped lay the foundation for intersectional analysis. And so one of the reasons why I talk about that as being a marginalized, a form of marginalized scholarship, right? That maybe appears to not be, there are a lot of people who use this framework, but it's still not normalized in the sense that people are generally not expected to do intersectional analysis in order for their work to be considered sound, right? The vast majority of sociological work, it still doesn't account for intersecting identities or overlapping oppression or privilege, even work that the field largely considers to be foundational or groundbreaking, right? So we see that happening. I think also as somebody who studies race and racism, I would say that most research of this type is considered marginalized broadly, right? And this is something that is historical and contemporary. Right. And so historically, scholars who study race have been themselves pushed to the margins. Right. Think about people like W.E.B. Du Bois or Anna Julia Cooper or Ida B. Wells again. Right. These Black scholars, they studied the impact of race and racism in America as far back as the 1800s. Right. And what's also important to know here is that these scholars understood what critical race theorists and other race scholars today know, which is that race was and is a primary organizing principle of the American landscape, right? So in other words, in order to fully understand social life and society, one had to understand the impacts of race and racism, not only for people of color, but also for white people, right? When this wasn't something that was happening. And we think, again, another aspect of this kind of historical marginalization, if we think about Du Bois, right, started the first school of sociology in America with the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory. But these scholars, right, Du Bois and the others that were there with him, they aren't given the same level of credit for these contributions that white men were, who didn't consider race at all, and who actually like intentionally excluded Du Bois from the field of sociology, even as he was doing much more sociologically sound work. And he was, developing research methodologies that hadn't even existed yet. And that these white men were like using and citing, right? It's kind of ridiculous. So now Du Bois he's considered part of the canon of sociological theorists, but in many cases, if you look at syllabi and talk to students about what they're learning, he just receives far less attention than his contemporaries like Marx or Weber or Park, right? So that's just the history of that. When we look contemporarily, again, studying race is still seen as a specialized field, right? It's an add-on in research that often just gets kind of thrown in without any significant consideration if it's put in there at all, right? For example, a lot of research is based on largely white samples, but it's still taken for granted as being generalizable to all, right? And if you talk to graduate students who often study race, and this may be something that you two are experienced or have experienced as well, they often share these stories about how faculty in their departments routinely dismiss their work or counsel them to pursue more quote unquote mainstream topics, right? So we're seeing that continued marginalization happen. And then finally, you could bring up critical race theory, right? I think that's clearly a marginalized perspective. It's something that is literally being actively marginalized right now, as many conservative politicians and school board members are passing this legislation that attacks CRT and with the intent of banning it from being taught in schools. This is mostly happening at the K through 12 level, which, it's not even being taught there anyway, but that's beside the point. But they're moving to college level too. So we're seeing this kind of active marginalization of something like critical race theory.
So I've definitely noticed within academia, everything you're talking about, like the marginalization of these scholars and how research does not really take this into account. And so how do you think academia can fix this moving forward to make sure that it becomes an important part of what we do as sociologists?
I mean, yeah, that's the question of the day right now, right? I mean, I think a big part of this is even recognition that these perspectives exist, and not only do they exist, that they are integral to our understanding, right? Again, right, like we need to, sociology, for example, really needs to retool the way we even teach, traditional theory, and the way we teach the foundation of our practice completely, right? Again, Du Bois and others, largely Black scholars, were the ones who really were doing actually what we would consider to be more true, more theory-based, more methodologically sound research, right? But we don't tell students about that. I know for sure I wasn't taught in my my main theory courses or anywhere that Du Bois was one of the founders of American sociology in that sense, right? He was just kind of an add-on. And so part of it is recognizing, openly and often that these marginalized perspectives do exist, and have credence the same as others. And we need to mainstream them more, right? We need to make sure that they sit at the centers of conversations as opposed to the margins, right? Like telling these students that these things are happening. And we need to change, again, a lot of it requires kind of changing perspectives that people have, because again, when we look at journals, what journals are considered to be the ones with the highest impact factors, or the best journals that you can submit to for sociological work, right? A lot of these really highly ranked journals are the ones where it's much harder to get work in that focuses on some type of marginalized group or practice, right? Or that people often will call research, right? Because it's about the group that the scholars actually belong to themselves. And so it's really kind of changing some of those norms that would help move some of this stuff forward a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was going to say, and I was having a conversation in class just this week about this, because in our social theory course, that is not built into the curriculum really. I mean, we do have a few. I will say we do have Black feminist theory, which isn't on the curriculum, but in terms of like the canon and the scholars that we are focusing on the most, it's not marginalized scholars. And there was a question posed about how to address that issue, and also how it affects students themselves, like current students that are of color in these primarily white institutions. And so I guess I was just wondering if you would like to share a bit more insight on, like, so the specific, whether you've noticed specific challenges in your own career within sociology, both as a student or as a professor, in having these conversations with white faculty, because like you said, a lot of the time there is no recognition, and also the whole thing about research, it's like it's taken for granted that white professors are white people.
Right.
And so yeah, could you speak a little bit more to that based on your own experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have experience of all these things that I'm talking about in terms of being marginalized because of the work you're doing, or having your work be marginalized. Like, that has all happened to me, right? As somebody that is a self-professed race scholar who really focuses on race and racism. Yeah, people, so let's give some examples. So when I'm presenting my work, right, in particular spaces, maybe for a job talk, or maybe for as a presentation somewhere else, right, just to a group of other scholars, I'll get questions very often about, do I have a comparison group, right, where they won't be asking that of, the white scholars, right? They won't ask, or the work that isn't specifically about race, right? So people always want you to compare, and inherent in that question is where are the white people, right? Like, they want to know, are you comparing to white folks? I had the experiences in grad school where I heard, faculty, not my advisors, thankfully, right, who were really supportive and do this, similar types of work. But I heard faculty, straight up talking about how, like, oh no, you telling other students, oh, you don't want to study race, right? You're going to put yourself in the box. Go study something else, right? Like, openly saying these things. Heard stuff like that, and so yeah, it's just a much different experience when you are engaging in this type of work, right? And then people kind of call you out for the researcher. And it's usually not as direct as, what I just said about somebody just saying straight up, like, don't study race, right? Typically, again, it comes in those kind of colorblind style arguments where it's very subtle, it's kind of hard to catch, and you're just like, wait a minute, did you really just like ask me that, but you're not asking some other people? Like, it makes you wonder, like, is that even a thing that I'm observing? So you definitely still get that. And in terms of like the challenges with maybe changing some of this, right? I think that there often are people who recognize that there has been historical marginalization that is going on, right? And when you think about like the canon of sociology, right? Like now there are lots more people, it's because of technology, it's a little easier to kind of get out some of this information, right? There are a lot more people talking about it, and scholars also are much more often now on like social media or going on to television or doing, interviews in other places. And so we see a lot more of this stuff than we did, a few decades ago. And so people recognize that there's a problem. However, although they'll acknowledge that there is a problem, and that, oh yeah, we need to do something to change the way we're teaching theory so that we include these more marginalized scholars. When it actually comes time to change their syllabi, all of a sudden then it becomes hard to do, right? Like, well, how do I do that? But we still need, basically they still make arguments for centering the traditional canon, which is just the white men, right? Like, no, they don't have a problem adding on like a week to talk about Du Bois, right? But like, there's still 4 weeks to talk about Weber, or 6 weeks to talk about Marx, right? Like, and so it still kind of echoes a lot of research that we see that looks at gaps between the expressed principles that particularly white Americans have versus their actual practices and the policies that they support, right? And so there's a well-known phenomenon called the principal policy gap, where white Americans will express wide support, right? A lot of high levels of support for the principles of equality, right? That we need to have equal opportunity for people, right? It should be based on merit, that that Black people and other people of color should have equal chances. But then when it comes down to supporting policies that are going to actually change things, all of a sudden that support drops off precipitously, right? And even my own research that I've done with the co-author most recently, we just published a paper where we kind of extended that, and we looked at the principal practice gap, right? So not only does it extend to supporting policies, it also extends to practice, right? We found that like when we did this study in corporate America space, people will say, again, they support these ideas of equal opportunity, of qualifications, in the workplace being applied fairly, et cetera. But then when it comes time to promote a Black man over a white man, in our study, almost all of them would not promote the Black man, even though that person was clearly shown through our study as being, equally on par with his white colleague, or actually maybe even above, right? He was the one who, in our scenario, he trained the white person to be good at his job, right? But then they still promote this white person. And so we're looking at stuff like that when it comes to actually changing what's happening in these classes or within sociology. Folks will say, yeah, we should do that. Yeah, we see a problem, but we still got to hold on to, what are we going to do about Marx, Weber, Park? We still got to talk about them, right? We still need to center them the most.
Yeah, Marina, you said something interesting about how like when white people do research, it's not considered me-search. And it made me think of how like whiteness is not really viewed as a race, but just like a defaultness. Like it's just a lack of a race instead of whiteness being a race. And I feel like when we have scholars, it's like, oh, this isn't a white scholar, this is just a scholar. Then when we have a Black scholar, it's a Black scholar. And I feel like that is like part of like the underlying viewpoint of how we view race and whiteness. And that's like, I don't know, a foundation of the problem of it, which is really frustrating to see it always happening.
Yes.
Also, you mentioned the word colorblindness a couple times, and I was wondering, I love colorblindness, talking about colorblindness, not being colorblind, I love talking about colorblindness. But do you think you could define that real quick for our audience so they know what that is?
Sure. So I mean, again, colorblindness is really just this idea that you're co-opting the language of equality. Really what ended up happening was that post-civil rights, people, white Americans, they co-opted the language of Dr. King and the civil rights movement, right, which was calling for equality. The famous I have a dream speech, right? I want my children to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, right? So they took that, flipped it on its head to now then say like, well, we should not look at anybody's race. We should only be looking at people as non-racialized, right? We should be colorblind. But the problem with colorblindness is that all it does is it really just serves to mask the fact that race still matters, racism still exists, and still is a significant factor in the outcomes for people of color, right? Because so effectively by saying you don't see race, you can't even see the problems that racism presents, right? It's impossible to make positive changes for racial equality if you don't think that race is a thing, right? Or if you are trying to ignore race.
Perfect. Thank you for that.
Hmm?
So moving on from that, our next question, you also brought up critical race theory. And this is a class that we're both in that you're teaching, but I was wondering for our audience, if you could define what critical race theory is and how this theory specifically helps us understand or address our current social issues related to race and racism.
Sure. And so critical race theory is just this theoretical perspective for and a practice of interrogating the role of race and racism in society, right? It's something that began in the 1970s. It builds upon groundwork that was laid by critical legal studies, the work of people like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a legal scholar. Again, she coined the term critical race theory. She was just out here coining terms, I tell you. And so as a practice, when we look at critical race theory, it's used to analyze and critique how the social construction of race and institutionalization of racism perpetuate a racial hierarchy that relegates people of color to like the bottom tiers of our society, right? And so it really helps us understand social issues by understanding a few foundational things, right? We could think of these as key tenets of critical race theory. So one, racism is seen as an ordinary part of everyday life, right? It's not an aberration. It's not this special thing that only happens in some places or something that only happens infrequently, right? It is literally a fact of life in our society, at least, right? Critical race theory also kind of comes from the assumption that race is a social construction, again, right? So it's something that was created. It is not something that's based in biology or genetics. Critical race theory also really focuses on the idea of interest convergence, or maybe other people talk about it in terms of material determinism. So it's this idea that major advances that we've seen in our society for people of color, they've only really happened as a result of the self-interest of whites and those in power, right? And so another big part of critical race theory is that historical context is essential for understanding racism, as is understanding that racism isn't limited to the acts of a few individuals or bad apples. It's embedded in our very institutions, and thus actually individual racists, they aren't even really needed for a racist system to perpetuate and racial inequality to persist. And then finally, CRT is intersectional and anti-essentialist, right? And so scholars who use critical race theory recognize that race intersects with other identities, right? Like your gender, your sexuality, your socioeconomic status, et cetera. And so while critical race theory, focuses on race, it doesn't only focus on race and ignore everything else, right? It actually is this intersectional, really complex understanding of things that are happening. And so through those, kind of baseline key tenets, there are other things that, critical race theorists might want to throw in there in as well, depending on who you're speaking with. That really, again, helps you to have a much fuller understanding of the ways that race and racism operate in our society, right? And again, continue to perpetuate white supremacy and continue to perpetuate racial status quo where people of color, in particular Black Americans, are relegated to bottom tiers.
I think personally, interest convergence was the most enlightening part of critical race theory, because I never really thought about these big advancements as just ways for white people to get ahead even more. And I was wondering if you could maybe give an example of when that happened once in our history of interest convergence.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's many different things that's happened. And so, and the other thing too, again, that we want to recognize here, this is what critical race theory helps us understand, is that that's just kind of a basis or an aspect of big changes and advances that we see for people of color. It's not to say that the change only happened because only it was going to do something right for white people, right? It was just, that was a huge part of the interest. And so if we think about, this came up even in the abolition of slavery as an example too here, right? Wait, so on the one hand, there were calls from, some of our colleagues will say, right, in Europe and other places, who were, you know, asking like, well, why y'all still got slavery? Why y'all still treating Black people like this, right? So they kind of called us out in some ways, and so that's a big part of it. When we think of, you know, even the civil rights movement, right? There were interests of white Americans that were aligned in many ways with, you know, what was happening here, right? Otherwise, a lot of that legislation wouldn't have passed, even if part of the operation of that was just like, let's get these people to shut up, right? Let's give them something, you know, because a lot of people are making noise, right? And that's what happens with large social movements, is people make noise essentially, and try to create change. So we saw that. And then also too, if we think about like, so let's see, the passing of legislation for, oh man, it just jumped out of my head. For a lot of social services that we have, right? So if we think about affirmative action as one example, right? What most people don't realize when they're pointing the finger at people of color, you know, and saying that affirmative action really just gives positions, jobs, other things, et cetera, to people of color who don't deserve it, is that the largest benefactors of affirmative action are actually white women, right? Like they are the ones who get the most, right? You see, and so like that's what critical race theory helps us understand, is that a large part, or a part of many of these big advances that we end up seeing for people of color, it comes because there are whites, and it doesn't mean all whites either, right? We want to be very clear here too, because historically, white elites, right? That's what we're talking about a lot of times. White elites, or the bigger portions of white Americans with the most power, they are very okay with sacrificing a few of their own, right? If it means then that people of color are not going to be able to get a leg up in the same sense, right? So again, this is part of the thing that critical race theory helps us understand, is that there's complexities to these issues. And it's one thing that, again, that I mentioned before, critical race theory it's anti-essentialist. And so it is never trying to say that everybody or everything, this experience is going to be exactly the same for that, right? And so even with this idea of interest convergence, it doesn't mean that all white people are going to benefit from whatever advances that are going to be given to people of color. It just means that the ones who they believe matter at the time, right? Like typically the elites or the larger portion of society, they are definitely going to benefit.
Yeah. And I don't know, this might be a loaded question. So it's okay if you don't have like a very elaborate answer, but so the idea of interest convergence, and just how some progress, because we do recognize that some progress has been made in some ways that come with other problems in terms of racial equality. So as of right now, in the current context of the US, so how do you see that playing out, the whole like interest convergence thing? Is it something that that we should be looking to as a solution, like as a tool for racial justice, or is it something that we just shouldn't like? We shouldn't strive for, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I got you. Kind of like knowing that it's, you know, kind of a bad basis for making a decision. Should we use it to the advantage of other folks? I mean, obviously people are going to have different opinions about that, right? I'm not even going to be able to speak to like the entirety of my opinion on this as well, but you know, part of my thinking would be like, I mean, if there's a way that we can get some of these changes that are more positive made, right? Like, I mean, whatever it takes, right? We want to do that. We want the best that we can have for the most people. That's one of the things that I try to think of. And so, yeah, if there's an instance where we can kind of use this, absolutely, right? So maybe one example that we could think of, right, is we know that in our educational system, because of, you know, things like of segregation, issues with segregation, the way that schools are funded, all these different things kind of coming together, that people of color who tend to be more highly concentrated in areas with higher levels of poverty are in schools where, you know, the school doesn't have funding like it needs. It's also not diverse at all, right? Most people of color, we know, particularly Blacks and Latinos, Hispanics, right, are in schools with higher proportions of other Black people and other Latinos and Hispanics, right? But one of the things that we know from research is that when schools are more integrated, everybody does better, right? Like even the white children, right? And so that's an area where we could talk about interest convergence being an idea here, right? Where, you know, that the positive momentum or movement for, you know, people of color at the bottom of society does converge with white people's interests as well, maybe in that case, right? At least on some level. And so that would be a space where I'd be like, absolutely, 100%, let's do it. And people use that argument all the time. It's like, your kids are gonna do better too. That's what the research says. So yeah, why not, right? Like I'm gonna use whatever tools at my disposal that I can, as long as it's not, I try to avoid obviously doing things at the expense of other people.
Right.
But that's about it.
Yeah, and I guess just going back to like something that you said before about how white people are not afraid to give some of their own. Like if we talk about like poor white people in rural areas, like those are other people that are not necessarily, they're benefiting from whiteness, but they're not benefiting in other ways. So that's, I guess, something else that maybe could, but that was like sort of a random question to throw in there.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. But if you think, again, there's historical precedents for a lot of this happening, right? Even what you were just talking about, right? So you think about the Black Panther movement, right? The shirt I got on right now, right? It's kind of nodding to that. You know, a lot of organizers historically have done that, right? Said like, hey, like, let's, you know, it kind of going back to what you were talking about with the whole bourgeois and proletariat, right? Like, they don't care about y'all either, right? Like, let's combine together, right? So that's why they had some social movements, right? Some leaders of the Black Panther pulling in white groups, right? Even some groups that, you know, were maybe much more aligned even with white supremacy, because they were saying like, hey, like y'all poor just like us. And so the government, these other people, they don't care about you either. So let's all get together, right? And that's, again, that has happened historically, all the way back to slavery, where the really poor indentured white servants were trying to organize with with the enslaved Blacks, right? And that's one of the reasons why we even had the slave codes developed, and why the system of slavery that we ended up having became developed in that way, is to keep those groups from coming together, because then all of a sudden you got a more powerful force, right? And so the higher ups, the elites, right, they understand that these things happen, and there is precedent for that to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess moving back to critical race theory real quick. There's a lot of discussion about it in the news and a lot of demonization of it. Have you faced any obstacles in creating the critical race theory class that we're in right now? And just in general, speaking up about critical race theory at all?
Yeah, so that's interesting, because like you said, there's so much opposition to it in so many different places now. So in terms of the specific course, no, I didn't really have any obstacles or experience any obstacles to creating the course. But one, I mean, the name of the course officially is just Topics in Sociological Theory, right? So it's possible that maybe people who might have objected to it weren't really aware that this course was about critical race theory specifically. So maybe they would have said something. I don't know if that would have been the case, you know, at UCF. With regards to speaking up about CRT, I mean, I've received or experienced the same general opposition that exists to the theory as it is misconstrued, at least overall, right? So, you know, there's that generalized opposition. I've, you know, posted like a video that I created for class about critical race theory, just literally explaining it online. And the only comments that I've gotten have been people basically arguing against it, or, you know, saying things like that. It's not been like hundreds of comments, it's only been a couple, but still. But what's interesting is that, you know, personally, I've actually seen more people interested in the topic than opposing it, right? So at UCF, you know, students like you all obviously have been, and others have been expressing a desire to learn about critical race theory for a while now. And when I speak to people outside of UCF, they're generally just kind of intrigued by the idea, right? Even those who have questions about whether or not it's taught in schools or should be, or any of that stuff, right? I guess obviously, to be fair, I don't necessarily run in circles with large numbers of people with the same, you know, political beliefs as those who are most vehemently opposing critical race theory. So perhaps the discussions will be different if I interacted a lot more with, you know, some of those folks. But yeah, I haven't experienced a ton. It's mostly just kind of questions, either like, oh, that's cool, what did people learn about? Or the biggest question is like, So is it really taught in these places, or is it blah, blah, blah? Like, that's really where the conversations end up going.
I was gonna ask, so like for like the laws and stuff that are trying to be passed, trying to like not let critical race theory or whatever they want to define it as be taught in schools, what is the step moving forward to push back against this type of like outrage against it?
I mean, people are doing lots of different things, but I mean, mainly, I think what people more like me are doing, you know, those who are critical race theorists, or those even who just kind of understand it better, are really just, you know, trying to respond every time with I mean, I hate using the word the truth now, just because people even misconstrue what that, they like to say what they believe is true. The fact is that critical race theory is not the ways that these people are characterizing it, right? There's these huge catch-alls that have nothing to do with critical race theory, or are literally the exact opposite of what critical race theory is, right? Like indoctrination, or putting people into boxes and saying that you are this because you have this identity, right? Like, as I explained, like that is not what critical race theory is. And so a lot of folks, you know, are just pushing back against that in every space and avenue that they can. Some people, obviously the ones who are more in certain realms of political activity, are, you know, probably pushing back or trying to run against people, you know, who are running for, you know, school boards or other spaces to talk about some of this. I mean, most of the, I guess, the political folks that I've seen, they really are just kind of ignoring it. They're like, well, I mean, it's not taught in school, so like, why are you bringing this up? So really, it's just kind of that. I mean, you know, we're just kind of figuring out like, well, most of us, I think, are just waiting for the next step. Like, is the shoe gonna drop? Are we gonna have to figure out something else to do? Because for me, it's just like, all right, so you're gonna tell me I can't, then I'm gonna figure out a way to do it that gets around what you said. But like, I'm not gonna stop. So.
Yeah, I had a follow-up question to that. So I know, and we mentioned this in our intellectual activism episode about, so right now we have bills against CRT. I believe so far it's been in up to 37 states. It might be more now, but so there's that. But in Florida, there's this Stop Woke Act, which kind of like plays on like all of those things. It's not just CRT, it's also LGBTQ plus sex ed and stuff like that. We talked about the Don't Say Gay Act, and I know that that's not your, like, you're not a sexuality or gender scholar specifically, but I was wondering if based on your expertise on critical race theory, do you notice a bigger, like, there's a bigger goal with these laws or bills that are trying to get passed, whether it's CRT or LGBTQ plus sex ed? So do you notice, based on your expertise, like that there's a bigger pattern and there's a bigger purpose to all of these laws?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to remember is that this is not new, right? This stuff has been happening. And when we think about any period in our history where there's been a lot of like significant social change, there's always a pushback after it happens, right? And that's not to dismiss the fact that there's pushback along the way. But, you know, once things happen, right, once like big changes come about, there's usually this massive, very strong reaction to that, right? So like right after the civil rights movement and the civil rights laws were passed, right, we saw reactions to that happening, right? Even back before then, right, in response to, you know, Reconstruction era policies where, you know, blacks, newly freed blacks were starting to become much more politically active and stuff. That's where we saw the founding of like the KKK, right? So we see this same type of thing happening in terms of these reactions. And so the overall pattern, again, is to counter some of that positive change. Well, obviously some of these people don't think it's positive, right? Even though we do, but to combat or reduce the impact of some of the social changes that are happening. So that's where we've seen these laws against, you know, critical race theory, or, you know, the Don't Say Gay bill and all these different things that are limiting this, is because, you know, there have been a lot of recent pushes and victories in certain areas where people are speaking about these things a lot more, right? And if you can change the ways or limit the ways in which folks are educated about this information, or can even talk about it, then that right there, you know, you can stop a lot of things from happening. You can kind of, you know, set us back, as it were, to previous times. So I think those are a lot of the goals that we're seeing happening with this now, is just kind of conservative broadly pushback against more liberalization of our society. I think people don't like change anyway, but then beyond that, right, like people feel like then, they've attached all these things to parts of their identity, and so then all of a sudden it becomes like this moralistic fight that they need to have. So that's really what we're seeing, is just different ways of doing that. And again, you got to remember that we had 2 terms of a Black president, right? Not only was he Black, he was a Democrat, right? And so he was, although again, if you look at his policies and what he actually did, he was very centrist and did not really there wasn't a lot of stuff that came out of his President Obama's presidency, where people might have expected, or as they might have expected. But even still, right? Black president, first one, 8 years of that, 8 years of, Democrats kind of in charge, really changing things and implementing lots of these different policies. And so we saw the immediate reaction to that, right? Donald Trump. It was the complete opposite, right? And so that's kind of what we're seeing, is this kind of back and forth that we typically see throughout history in many ways. It's kind of like the taking back of ground, and then also like the setting up of power and stuff, so then folks can try to dictate where we go for the next 10 years or whatever.
Okay, so in our class we talked about W.E.B. Du Bois, and read a book by Alden Morris called The Scholar Denied, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Birth of Modern Sociology. And so the author discusses how, if the Atlanta school founded by Du Bois and his work remained influential despite being marginalized, but it was influential, and it says, quote, amid the terrorism of lynch mobs, attacks from elites within the community it sought to liberate, and discrimination from a racist society that withheld crucial resources, then maybe there is hope for all who work to produce knowledge for the purpose of understanding and transforming humanity. So I have 2 questions. I'll ask the first one first. So first, how do you see the future of sociology in these times where CRT and other perspectives by scholars of color continue to be marginalized and attacked?
So again, like I said, right, none of this is new. It's just more accessible for us, via technology at the time. And so really when I think about the future, again, we'll find a way, right? Even when it's difficult, people who are marginalized, people who study marginalized things, right? People who fight for the rights of marginalized peoples, right? They have always found a way, right? Have always found a way to be able to push back, subvert systems, to try to make more positive change, right? And so I know it feels rough right now, and it is in many different ways, right? But we're gonna keep pushing. It's not, again, there are many people who are not gonna stop, and there are new people every day, right, being kind of brought into the fight in that sense, right? And again, that's also like the point of a lot of the work, right? Particularly for people who like to utilize their scholarship towards like productive ends of change, right? We want to create space. We want to take back space maybe that was taken, right? We want to change our social world in positive ways. So then, towards the goal, ultimately, I think of no longer having these marginalized categories, or no longer having it so that people's life outcomes are so determined by things like their race or their gender or sexual identity or orientation, right? And so that's what we want to do, is just keep on. You got to keep fighting, right? Like that's really what you got to do. Just keep pushing forward.
Yeah, I really like that you had that was very hopeful. And I think for people who believe that there are problems in society, that there needs to be also a belief that it can change, or else it's just like an overwhelmingly depressing thought to have. And that can ultimately burn you out really quickly if you believe all these negative things are happening, but that also people and society and these things can't be changed. So I really like that answer a lot.
Yeah, and it reminds me of what we've read in class too, mainly how just like there's racist ideologies, there's always like an oppositional ideology that strives for racial justice. There's always been that. So that goes back to your answer. But so the second question that I had is, so what are some, I guess this kind of plays into what you just said, but what are some words of encouragement that you have for marginalized people and students as a whole, particularly Black students and educators at a time like this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely I would encourage folks to stay the course, right? Keep speaking out against discrimination and oppression, right? Keep fighting to reclaim space, right? Keep pursuing the work or the avenues, right, that you are passionate about, right? Even when people obviously, you know, again, are pushing back against it or trying to put you in a box or say that you can't do this, right? That's one of the things that I, you know, talk to grad students about all the time. It's like, man, like, ignore the haters, right? People are always going to say, there's always gonna be somebody that has something to say about what you want to do, or say you need to be doing something else, or try to tell you you can't do this, you can't do that, right? But yet and still, people still find space to do these things all the time, right? So like, just keep going. Somebody's gonna like it, somebody's gonna want it. There's gonna be a space for that, right? Particularly for like graduate students in some of these spaces who are getting the words directly or indirectly from their advisors or from other faculty members that they should be studying something else or not limiting themselves just to this one thing, right? Like that was something that I fought with a lot when I was in grad school. Was I felt this pressing need to expand my research interests because I wanting to study Black men and Black masculinity in particular. That's what I looked at when I was in grad school previously. Then I got to this program, I was like, oh my God, it's too narrow, nobody's gonna hire me, blah, blah. Right, and thankfully, again, I had some advisors who really pushed back against that. And we're like, that's like, don't listen to that mess, right? Like, you're good, you keep studying what you want to study, there is a space for that. And so that's what I try to pass on to a lot of grad students now is keep doing it. If you're passionate about it, man, go forward, keep doing that work. The space is there. Don't listen to these other people, because again, there are always going to be people trying to say that stuff. Also, then I would say too, right, really seek out support. Because a big part of this, right, again, the marginalization, if we go back to those perspectives, right, it's very functional, right? When you are marginalized, it makes you feel alone. It makes you feel like you're the only one who's experiencing this, or one of very few. When in reality, there are so many other people that are experiencing the exact same thing you are. And so go find the support, right? Other scholars, if you're looking for work, try to find, to the degree that you can, right, a job, a school, department, an organization that values your work and gives you a space to create and do the things that you want to do. Other people, right? You know, that's one of the benefits of all this tech that we have now. So there's all these like social groups. You can go on Twitter and be with different people, or on some other social media platform and find folks that are the same as you, or that would support what you're doing, even if they're not the same as you. So you want to get that support. And then finally, I think kind of a point that Hallie had brought up, right? This self-care, like that is the thing that I've been pushing big time these past few years, right? This is difficult. It can be really difficult work. Again, the feelings of being marginalized outside of even like what is you're doing, right? That can really press down, right? There's a reason why oppression is called that, right? You feel you are being oppressed. So take a step back if you need to, right? That's fine. You take some rest, right? Like you don't have to keep running the entire time, right? Remember that you can't do this work if you're not taking care of yourself first, right? Like if you're dead because you've stressed yourself out that much, or you've you haven't sought out help and support, what good are you going to be, right? Like, how's that going to help anything? How's that going to further causes that you believe in? How's that going to get the research out that you want to study? And so make sure that you're taking time to really engage in self-care, and as much as you can, try not to let things impact your feelings of joy and your feelings of peace, right? Like, you want to try to hold on to that as much as possible. So that's what I would say, I think, to folks who are, struggling with a lot of these things now, right? Because there's so much to struggle with. We got to realize that we're not alone. We're not the only ones doing it. There's support out there, and we got to take care of ourselves first.
Yeah, I really identify with everything you just said, just because, and I talked about it a little bit with, with Hallie and with other friends from the program, and even then, it is uncomfortable to talk about just how, because you do feel marginalized as a whole, like in general in the program, and right now with everything else going on, and then those of us that are more interested in studying race and critical race theory and all those things, it's kind of it's really like, what's the word that I'm looking for? Intimidating. It's really intimidating to be in a program that's obviously primarily white, and also where in the environment that we're in the state that we live in the literal state that we live in, it's kind of difficult to do this research without feeling like there's a constant threat out there, because there is a threat. So yeah, I really appreciate your insight on self-care, and we did talk about it in our intellectual activism episode, and how it's actually a destructive thing. It's they use the word it's a weapon of mass destruction or something like that, of warfare. Yeah, because that is literally what the system is built to not do for us. So for us to take care of ourselves and to take time so that we can continue challenging, that's exactly what they don't want.
Right.
That's exactly what we are not like accustomed to. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, is there any last like topics or anything that you wanted to cover or that you wanted our audiences to know about before we wrap up the episode, or anything that you want to go more in depth in?
I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily like any other topics that I want to go in depth in, but on the, kind of as we've been talking the past couple of minutes about the future and encouragement and what people should do, right? I definitely, I try to stay positive about these things, but I definitely don't want to, dismiss the fact of what, Marina just brought up, right? Like there are definite realities that exist for marginalized peoples and for people that decide to push back in any way against systems of oppression or marginalization, right? Like people are losing their lives. People who don't lose their lives still, they receive death threats, right? You should just ask, some scholars and some people speak about this stuff, what kind of things that they receive, or the messages and things that they get from people. So there's definitely a strong reality of this, right? I think a big part of my, push for, saying stay the course is that while I'm recognizing that there are definite realities that go along with this, that it can lead to significant negative impacts for folks, right, that are really problematic for people's lives. At the same time, the fact of marginalization also does it, right? So like often people of color, particularly if you inhabit certain social spaces in this life with certain social identities, like your life is already at risk, right? Like again, like a big thing for me is a huge part of my identity to me is that I'm a Black man. And so like, I can't ignore the fact that like, I don't need to be talking about anything. I could be the most pro-white supremacy, the most pro-status quo person ever in the world, and I still walk out into these streets and get shot by a cop, right? Or somebody else with, or attacked by somebody, right? Again, we think about like Ahmaud Arbery, right? Who literally was just running through the neighborhood and was shot to death, right? He was, literally tailed by some white men and lynched. Right? Like we see these things happening. So again, when I say, press forward, keep going, right? Like stay the course, seek out support and all these things. It's not to suggest that there aren't these real realities for people, right? It's just also that, oppressed people have been living in this forever, right? And so like, it's also a part of our realities that at any moment, there are negative things that are going to happen to us because of the identities that we serve, right? Like, you all as a Latino woman, right? Like there are realities of your existence, that happen here in terms of how people are going to perceive you or look at you, right? Or maybe exoticizing, or all these different things that come along with that, right? And then in Hallie, right, as a Jewish woman, right, we clearly know that there are people out here trying to act like the Holocaust didn't happen, right? Like to this day, right? You know what I mean? And so like, it's still, we know that there are the literal outcomes to this that impact people's lives to varying degrees, right? And so I definitely don't want to dismiss that, but like, that's a fact of our reality. And so at the same time, it's also like, a sense of power that we can try to recruit some power out of this, even though it's literally killing us at some times, right? To use that as momentum as we're moving forward, right?
Yeah. So I guess just to end on a more positive note, we do, this podcast is part of like our way to kind of reach outside of the institution and to an audience that's not, and I mean institution, academia specifically, reach out to people that are outside of it, and to the broader community, and hopefully make these concepts and these ideas more understandable, and kind of raise awareness about all of these issues, and hopefully get people to join us, join our side, and support these measures and help us in challenging these systems of oppression. So, no big deal, like not a big responsibility at all, but this podcast, this is why we have you here. We want to get more voices and more people that can speak to these issues and provide a different perspective that's not necessarily the centered perspective within academia or even outside of it, just in general. Do you agree, Hallie?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And on that, is there any work or anything that you'd like to plug for yourself, Dr. Cox, or even like ways for people to contact you or certain social media pages that they can find you?
Sure. I have a website. It's JonathanMCox.com. And so there on that site, you can see a lot of my work. There's links for various articles and things that I've put out. There's also links to contact me if people want to reach out to have me come speak or do things like this. So there's that space that also has all my social media on there, because I'm on Twitter, and so I do a lot of, that's the main avenue currently that I'm using in terms of getting work out or just expressing ideas and things, right, and engaging with the community of scholars beyond. So I definitely welcome people to follow me in that sense. Those would be the things that I would say.
Awesome. Everyone, please go check that out and follow and all of that stuff.
We'll have the links below too, so in the description of the episode. So thank you so much, Dr. Cox, for being with us once again. And this is a great conversation, and it's a conversation that is absolutely needed. And we really hope that it has an impact, and we will be promoting the hell out of it.
Absolutely.
Yes. So thank you so much again.
Thank you.
I don't know what else.
Well, I appreciate it again. So it's great. Thanks for having me on here. This is really great work that you're all doing. I think it's amazing because, again, I'm really big on getting stuff out to the public outside of the walls of academia, right? Journal articles are great, but the only people who read them are other scholars. And so whatever we can do to get some of this stuff out to people beyond, I think can be much more impactful. So bravo to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we have a very exciting announcement to make. This has actually been the last episode for what we will call Chapter 1 of Free the Mind, Free the People.
In this first chapter, as an overview, we have introduced our podcasts and ourselves by placing us within sociology. And those episodes were Welcome to Free the Mind, Free the People, Hallie's story, where I talk about my grandpa's experience as a Holocaust survivor, and Rena's story as she talks about moving to the US from Puerto Rico. We then moved into our inspiration for this podcast during the episode, Intellectual Activism and the War on Education. And finally, we then showed intellectual activism in progress during our episodes interviewing Dr. Rivera and Dr. Cox.
Yes, so basically for Chapter 1, we contextualize sociology and our identities and this podcast in and of itself. And now for Chapter 2, we will be getting more into how to apply sociology and a sociological lens to our daily lives. So we hope that Free the Mind, Free the People has been helpful to all of you who are listening, and that you will join us in the next chapter.
Thank you to everyone who's listened, and please continue listening and share and like and show all your friends. So for Chapter 2, we have more people that we can teach and that can join our little community.
Yes. All right. See ya next time.
Yeah. We'd also like to thank the University of Central Florida Department of Sociology for their generous support of this podcast.